They make drugs. They refine drugs. They make cocaine. They have cocaine factories.
At 4:03 a.m., the quiet picture of the Arizona desert changed. More than 3,200 federal agents were already moving into position across the state, preparing to strike 147 locations linked to a threat that had quietly grown inside American territory. Investigators suspected the presence of a criminal network connected to CJNG, one of the most aggressive fentanyl producers in the Western Hemisphere, and a group long targeted by U.S. sanctions. This was not a normal enforcement action. It was the opening move in a confrontation between the United States and a hidden architect who had been shaping a criminal pipeline beneath Arizona's surface. And as the operation began, officials realized they were uncovering only the first layer of a much larger structure waiting in the dark. The discovery that followed would force the country to rethink what border security truly means. And before we move into the tunnels buried beneath this landscape, make sure to subscribe to Military Power so you never miss the deeper investigations behind operations like this. Federal investigators reached a turning point when they uncovered 5 reinforced tunnels running from Mexico into Arizona. This discovery marked the moment when the case shifted from a routine narcotics investigation to a direct threat to national security. The tunnels were not improvised passages created for a single transport run. They represented a long-term project built with careful engineering, and they revealed how deeply organized crime had advanced beneath an area considered stable and predictable. The investigation began months earlier, when analysts noticed a sudden rise in overdose cases across several Arizona counties. Hospitals reported clusters of fentanyl-related emergencies following patterns that suggested a consistent supply of high-purity narcotics. At the same time, patrol units observed unusual nighttime movement along remote desert roads. Vehicles appeared on tracks rarely used by the public, and some left tire marks that did not match local traffic. Warehouse managers near the border also filed reports about suspicious activity inside facilities that were supposed to be inactive. These early signs pushed federal teams to expand their surveillance coverage and examine the possibility of underground movement, a tactic that had been documented in previous cross-border cases. When ground sensors and aerial scans confirmed irregular heat signatures beneath the surface, agents began a systematic search. They knew that several tunnels discovered in earlier years had been built with concrete walls, ventilation systems, and lighting strong enough to support long-distance transport. Some extended nearly 3,000 feet, carrying narcotics directly beneath the frontier. With this history in mind, the sudden anomalies detected near Arizona's southern corridor raised immediate concern. The investigation intensified until field teams found the first opening concealed behind a false storage wall. That tunnel led to 4 more, each hidden inside locations that outwardly appeared harmless. The structure of the tunnel showed a level of preparation that surprised even experienced personnel. Concrete reinforcement lined the interior, preventing collapse and allowing steady movement. Electrical wiring powered a string of lights that remained active despite their position underground. Ventilation machinery kept air flowing through the passage, and steel rails placed along the floor allowed carts to move heavy cargo with little effort. The design resembled a miniature subway system built entirely out of sight. This level of construction indicated significant investment and long-term planning, far beyond what small groups could accomplish. At the end of each tunnel, investigators found large storage zones containing 62 sealed containers. When opened, these containers revealed fentanyl in both pill and powder form, along with methamphetamine packed in industrial-sized blocks. Large bundles of cash were stored alongside the narcotics, tightly wrapped to avoid detection. Labels on the packages matched symbols that federal agencies have associated with CJNG in previous seizures. The consistency of the markings left little doubt that the same organization had designed and supplied the shipments. The discovery confirmed that CJNG had established a physical footprint inside the United States by building infrastructure beneath Arizona. Rather than relying on short-term smuggling attempts, The group had constructed a stable logistics pipeline positioned below ground. The tunnels served as the first structural layer of a wider system that investigators believed stretched far beyond the state line. This finding forced officials to reconsider the scale of the threat and to prepare for the possibility that the tunnels were only the beginning. More evidence would be needed to understand the network's full reach, and that search would lead investigators deeper into the system that powered the flow of narcotics across the region. The operation reached its decisive moment at 4:03 a.m. when federal teams launched a coordinated strike across Arizona. This action marked the beginning of the largest federal raid in the state's history, and it followed weeks of preparation inside a secure command center. The scale of the deployment reflected the seriousness of the threat uncovered during the investigation. Agencies that normally conduct separate missions joined together under a unified structure designed to dismantle a complex criminal network that had grown across multiple regions. Planning for the operation took place inside a facility built for high-risk coordination. Analysts reviewed intelligence from surveillance flights, ground sensors, and financial tracking systems. Each team received a clear description of its responsibilities, and planners ensured that movements would be synchronized to prevent any suspect from receiving a warning. The operation followed the style of major federal task forces that have been used in national cases involving narcotics distribution. It included personnel from the FBI, DEA, HSI, CBP, and the U.S. Marshal Service. State-level tactical units and local police departments also contributed officers, forming a combined force of more than 3,200 members. The air wing of the carrier received the alert at the same moment. The MH-60R helicopter assigned to anti-submarine duties prepared for immediate launch. Federal teams understood that any delay would give suspects time to destroy evidence or flee to secondary sites. For that reason, the command center established a shared timeline. Teams were instructed to move only when they received a single radio signal that would activate across all channels. That moment arrived precisely at 4:03 a.m. when the command issued the order that set the entire deployment into motion. The impact of the coordinated advance was visible immediately. Helicopters equipped for night operations moved over Phoenix and Tucson to provide aerial support and track movements on the ground. Their infrared systems allowed them to identify heat signatures around the target locations. Armored vehicles traveled through residential areas to support entry teams and to block escape routes. These vehicles provided additional protection for agents who were expected to face armed resistance in certain locations. SWAT teams positioned at the front of each group used specialized tools to enter buildings quickly. Battering devices allowed them to break through reinforced doors that had been installed by criminal groups to delay law enforcement. Entry teams were trained to move efficiently through narrow hallways and storage rooms, and their tactics were shaped by earlier intelligence that showed how some locations had been modified to slow government access. The operation focused on 147 targets identified during the investigation. These sites included residential properties used as stash houses, warehouses labeled as agricultural facilities, small offices connected to shell companies, and apartments suspected of hosting mid-level coordinators. Some targets were part of transportation hubs where cargo could be shifted between vehicles without drawing attention. Each location had been selected after analysts confirmed that it played a role in the movement or storage of narcotics. As teams entered the first wave of locations, several encounters demonstrated how organized and prepared the network had become. In a number of buildings, armed individuals attempted to block the entry routes. Tactical units responded with smoke devices to limit visibility and to create a controlled environment that reduced the risk to officers. Flash devices were used in situations where suspects refused to surrender. These tools allowed teams to complete their entry without causing unnecessary harm, and to secure the area before evidence could be destroyed. In other locations, agents encountered guard dogs trained to protect the properties. K-9 units working with federal teams helped neutralize these threats and ensured that the search of the premises could proceed safely. Drone support also played an important role. Aerial drones monitored rooftops and alleys and alert teams to movement in areas not visible from the ground. This system ensured that attempts to escape were detected in real time. By the end of the initial wave, federal agents had gained control of every target site. The success of the 4:03 a.m. strike demonstrated the effectiveness of multi-agency cooperation and the value of extensive preparation. The synchronized entry prevented the suspects from coordinating a response. It also opened the way for investigators to examine the locations in detail and to identify connections that would help them understand the larger structure behind the criminal network. The findings that followed would reveal how deeply the organization had embedded itself and why the operation needed to continue beyond the first phase. The investigation relied heavily on financial documents, transport logs, and encrypted phone files recovered during earlier searches. When analysts compared the records, they noticed consistent patterns in the timing and volume of shipments. These patterns formed a clear route that started in Mexico, moved through Arizona, and continued toward Phoenix before reaching major distribution hubs in Chicago and Detroit. The route remained stable over time and followed predictable cycles, which suggested that the organization responsible had invested significant resources into maintaining a dependable supply line. The seizure of 733 pounds in one facility suggested that the location was a regional hub, not a one-time hideout. It was built to sustain long-term operations. The transfers ranged from $40,000 to $70,000 every 2 weeks. When calculated over a 3-month period, the total approached $480,000 for some recipients. These figures were large enough to attract immediate attention because they indicated that the individuals involved might have been providing access or information to support the movement of shipments along the route. Federal officials noted that similar cases had been documented in previous national investigations, where employees in security roles were arrested for assisting criminal organizations through financial misconduct. The investigation also extended to Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport. Records showed that 5 cargo workers had received substantial weekly payments that did not correspond to their regular earnings. The funds appeared in their accounts through digital transfers classified as consulting fees issued by logistics companies that existed only on paper. The pattern of deposits suggested that the workers were participating in an activity that required coordination with external actors. Although the exact nature of their involvement remained under review, analysts determined that the payments were connected to the broader trafficking network identified earlier. The discovery of the 2.4-ton monthly pipeline prompted authorities to expand their investigation further. They sought to identify the leadership structure responsible for coordinating the shipments and to determine how widely the misconduct had spread. The findings strengthened the case for continued federal involvement and for reforms aimed at reducing opportunities for internal compromise. The next stage of the operation would look deeper into the organization's command framework, which investigators believed held the key to dismantling the network entirely. Federal investigators began to understand the complexity of the trafficking structure when the same code name appeared repeatedly in the material collected during the early stages of the operation. The name was El Arquitecto, and it surfaced in encrypted messages, digital payment ledgers, and surveillance images tied to locations across Arizona. The repetition suggested that this individual played a central role in coordinating the network. As analysts examined the evidence, they concluded that the figure behind the name functioned as the strategic planner responsible for shaping the system that allowed the organization to operate on such a large scale. The investigation into El Arquitecto began with the digital records found in several storage sites. Encrypted devices contained message traffic showing ongoing communication between multiple participants in the network. While the identities of the senders were concealed, the content provided enough context for analysts to recognize a pattern. The communications referenced schedules, routing instructions, and operational details that matched the timelines uncovered in the financial analysis. Each chain of data pointed back to the same coordinating presence. This led investigators to search for more information within the remaining seized files, particularly those connected to warehouse facilities near Tucson. One of these facilities held a concealed server that operated without external markings. When technicians examined the system, They discovered that it connected to a remote command location that was not listed in any conventional directory. The link provided real-time access to maps showing the movement of shipments across several states. It also tracked the timing of incoming loads passing through the tunnels discovered earlier. The server functioned as an information hub, gathering data from multiple sources and feeding it back to the figure identified as El Arquitecto. The existence of this infrastructure demonstrated a level of planning that went far beyond field-level coordination. As investigators pieced together the information, a clearer picture emerged of the role played by the individual behind the code name. The evidence indicated that El Arquitecto had structured the logistical chain from its earliest stages. The layout of the tunnels reflected an understanding of engineering requirements, including ventilation needs and structural support. The coordination of transport routes showed an ability to calculate timing across long distances, ensuring that shipments moved along predictable paths without interruption. The design of the communication channels suggested a familiarity with encryption tools, as well as a method for distributing operational instructions in ways that minimized exposure. The strategic importance of El Arquitecto became more apparent when analysts compared the findings with past national investigations. In many cases involving international criminal groups, authorities identified planners who served as architects of the organization's internal systems. These individuals played a different role from high-profile leaders who controlled territory. Instead, they shaped the financial, logistical, and cyber structures that allowed the network to function across borders. Several federal agencies have noted that the disruption of these architects often has a greater long-term effect on the organization than the arrest of street-level operators. The patterns seen in Arizona aligned with these historical examples, suggesting that El Arquitecto belonged to the category of planners who build networks designed to endure over time. The presence of such a figure also offered insight into the evolution of the group responsible for the tunnels and the trafficking flow. The structure of the system reflected characteristics commonly associated with modern transnational organizations. These groups rely on data, digital coordination, and adaptive logistics to manage operations across multiple regions. They function more like covert corporations than traditional street-level groups. The evidence gathered in Arizona showed that the network had adopted these methods, and El Arquitecto appeared to be the central designer behind the transition. The full results of the operation became clear once federal teams had secured all target locations across Arizona. By the end of the initial phase, more than 5,500 suspects were taken into custody. The individuals detained represented a wide range of roles inside the network. Some served as couriers responsible for transport between local sites, while others acted as mid-level coordinators who managed storage points and schedules. Investigators also identified several insiders working in sensitive positions who were suspected of providing access or information to support the movement of shipments. The number of arrests reflected the depth of the network and confirmed that the operation had targeted a structure that extended far beyond the individuals encountered at the surface level. As the arrests continued, federal agencies deployed evidence transport vehicles to collect material recovered from the sites. Long lines of trucks moved between the locations and secure processing centers. Each load contained items that would later be analyzed to understand the full scope of the activity. The volume of material demonstrated how extensive the organization's operations had become. Agents recorded shipments of narcotics, cash, weapons, and electronic devices believed to contain communication data. These findings allowed investigators to estimate the amount of illicit product that had been moving through the network before the operation began. One of the most significant discoveries involved the quantities of narcotics stored inside several warehouses. Federal teams recovered fentanyl and methamphetamine in volumes large enough to produce millions of doses. The presence of so much material in a single operation stood out even when compared with previous national cases. In many federal seizures, the confiscation of a few hundred kilograms of fentanyl is considered a record-level event. The Arizona operation far exceeded those benchmarks, showing that the network possessed a stable supply line and enough storage capacity to support long-term distribution. The concentration of narcotics in multiple locations also suggested that the organization had prepared for rapid movement into different regions when required. Investigators also uncovered significant quantities of cash stored throughout the state. The totals reached several $1 million across all locations, and the denominations suggested that the funds were linked to proceeds generated by the monthly 2.4-ton pipeline identified earlier in the investigation. The presence of such large amounts of currency in physical form indicated that the network still relied on cash-based transfers for certain stages of its operation. Analysts noted that the concentration of money in specific buildings provided additional insight into the financial structure supporting the trafficking activities. Weapons recovered from the sites added another layer to the findings. Agents documented rifles and handguns commonly associated with criminal networks operating in the region. Many of the weapons matched types previously seized in cases connected to organized groups. The presence of these weapons indicated that the network had prepared for the possibility of armed confrontations, especially in locations where narcotics and currency were stored. The recovery of ammunition and protective equipment suggested that certain sites had been organized to withstand sudden law enforcement action, although the coordinated timing of the operation prevented suspects from mounting a significant response. The final stage of the investigation made clear that the network uncovered in Arizona represented a deeper challenge than a regional criminal operation. The findings exposed a structural breach that allowed a transnational group to operate inside multiple layers of American infrastructure. The system extended from underground tunnels to airport facilities and from compromised personnel to concealed digital servers. This level of infiltration showed how easily illegal activity could blend into legitimate environments when oversight mechanisms were not prepared for threats of this scale. The operation demonstrated that the issue was no longer limited to border activity, but had reached a point where institutional strength itself needed to be reassessed. A series of security reforms followed the operation. Border regions received additional personnel, along with new detection technology, such as seismic sensors, aerial surveillance systems, and infrared cameras used to monitor open terrain. Internal audits were expanded to ensure that personnel records remained consistent and that potential vulnerabilities could be identified early. These measures formed part of a broader strategy aimed at reinforcing systems that had been exposed during the investigation. Airports also introduced new safeguards. Biometric verification was added to cargo areas, and digital labeling systems were designed to prevent unauthorized adjustments. Employee rotation schedules were updated to reduce long-term exposure in positions where the risk of external influence was higher. Training programs emphasized the national impact of narcotics trafficking and the importance of maintaining secure operational practices. Community initiatives supported these institutional reforms. Mental health services were expanded in regions affected by overdose trends, and schools received resources to address the growing impact of narcotics on families. Local governments coordinated with federal agencies to host public briefings where analysts explained how the network had been identified. These discussions helped communities understand the complexity of the threat and the need for long-term vigilance. The national implications of the operation became clear as other states reviewed the methods used in Arizona. Operation Desert Citadel emerged as a model for multi-agency coordination and structural analysis. The findings aligned with broader federal efforts directed at combating fentanyl trafficking, dismantling transnational organizations, and reducing the risks associated with digital networks used to coordinate illicit activity. The operation illustrated that addressing such threats required a combination of enforcement, oversight, and public engagement. It also demonstrated that long-term stability would depend on a national approach capable of identifying vulnerabilities before they could be exploited again. As this investigation closes, the scale of the threat and the response speak for themselves, reminding us that security is a collective responsibility. Don't forget to subscribe to Military Power so you never miss the next report.